One of the greats.
It's a wonderful parallel, isn't it, to be passing the Royal Albert Hall, because of course all those years that determined to attend the Festival of Remembrance on Remembrance Weekend, the eve of the Remembrance service at the Cenotaph, the buzz among 5,000 people in that hall when she arrived at just before 7 o'clock on Saturday evening was remarkable, with people really feeling that the Queen's authority and the Queen's blessing on what was happening was indispensable. It wasn't the same event, and isn't the same event, won't be the same event without her, although of course the King will, and already has impressed lots of people with the way that he's
everyone wanted an imprimatur on these events. And wasn't it wonderful the way the procession took in almost all the great memorials, all the way through, not just the Cenotaph and the Women at War, but up to Hyde Park Corner. There's the New Zealand War Memorial, the Australian War Memorial. I mean, every aspect of shared sacrifice, I think, has been recognised today through this exemplary procession.
I was really struck as well, Katie, by the way in which the procession, the initial procession, which arrived at the Abbey in silence, a sense of expectation but deep respect. The service itself really did underline lots of the themes that Her Majesty wanted to have underlined. She was, of course, a woman of strong faith.
She was.
It had informed lots of the decisions that she'd made in her life and the way that she'd lived her life.
I think you're absolutely right, and we saw the faith reflected in that service with some of her favourite hymns, readings that date back to the coronation. There was everything had been so carefully considered and thought out, and punctuated with the most important things in her life: her faith, the armed forces, her family, her people. It's all there, and I think also that sense that yes, we have lost something very, very special to all of us. This is a testimony to that. But in all of this, and as Robert says, the tradition and the history and the landmarks and everything that's wrapped into this is the promise of the new. It's the continuity. We've seen that in the past 11 days, extraordinary days, and how the new king has been welcomed. But we saw that in the procession with Prince George and Princess Charlotte. That promise of the future, that promise of what's next to come. And I think that's reassuring, particularly at the moment.
Yes, the presence of Princess Charlotte there, a reminder of some of the extraordinary changes that the late Queen made during her reign. I mean, it was only in 2011. She changed hundreds, thousands of years of male primogeniture, so that, you know, the line of succession has changed. All these that's so much. I mean, when historians look back on this reign, they'll see so many small ways in which, very quietly but very firmly, she completely transformed this institution. And I also love the way today that the procession, it wasn't just about recognising her. I mean, obviously, clearly it was, but in her way, when she organised it, she wanted to recognise others. I thought the way in which she placed the Victoria Cross and the George Cross holders right at the front of that procession, for example, that was so her. You know, the George Cross, the great decoration invented by her father at the height of the war. You know, all these little things. There's a lot of nods, I think, to her parents in that.
And to the Commonwealth, the Mounties. I mean, it was all there, down to the NHS workers and everyone that helped us through the pandemic.
Most recent recipients of the George Cross, of course, the NHS.
Last word then from us before we go to our colleagues at Windsor for the next phase of the day. And Katie, you first of all, it's in terms with such a momentous change in public life and in personal lives.
I think what we've seen today, we have seen the embodiment of greatness from the world leaders gathered to what we're seeing now, an entire nation coming out. This is greatness in our time, and that greatness is really down to this extraordinary monarch, her life shaped by three people in particular: her father, her darling father, her beloved mother, and of course her beloved Philip. And I just think it is so powerful that here she is, she's on her way, and after all this grandeur and greatness, tonight she'll be reunited with them for eternity.
Well, we are looking at the progress of the procession of the State Hearse to Windsor, to the royal town of Windsor, where the final committal will take place a little later this afternoon, and our coverage continues. We will be following the journey, Queen's last journey out of London, to her home at Windsor Castle, and then we'll be following the new procession that will take place at Windsor, and of course the service at St. George's Chapel. And as we look at the vehicles making their way, and the State Hearse in particular, you can see the bright colours of the Royal Standard and the crown and the orb and sceptre, telling everyone along the way that this is Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, a Christian of conviction who, more than anyone, understood the message of the preacher, which is that there is a time and season to all things, a time to be born and a time to die. Queen understood that as part of the natural rhythm of life and the natural transition of the great constitution that she's upheld over many, many years. She's returning home to Windsor. Let's join Kirsty Young.
Yes, and so the grand and exquisite ceremonial tableau of that magnificent state occasion gently recedes into the background as the Queen's coffin makes its way now through London and out towards Windsor. Welcome to the splendour of Windsor Castle, the near 1,000-year-old home of royalty and the backdrop to many great battles and grand banquets. But today sees maybe its most momentous event, the burial of our longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen will this afternoon finally be laid to rest in St. George's Chapel alongside her beloved parents, sister and husband. So many days of grand public ceremony will come to an intimate ending as Her Majesty passes into history. We'll see the Queen's coffin making its journey towards Windsor and the committal service, which will be attended by the King, the rest of the royal family, and also Her Majesty's closest friends. Windsor Castle is certainly exquisitely grand and imposing, but it's also a place where the Queen, and then of course a little princess, played as a toddler on the lawn, found safety as a teenager during the Blitz, rode her ponies, nursed her children, walked her dogs. Having left her cherished home in the Scottish Highlands 11 days ago, today she will come to rest for eternity in the home that was so important it gave name to her family. Well, the town of Windsor is, of course, a major tourist destination. It's used to crowds, but today its streets have taken on a unique character. The grounds of the chapel and the edges of the long walk are carpeted with bouquets of flowers. And the thousands of visitors, some local and many more from far-flung corners of the globe, are quietly positioning themselves to take one last look at Her Majesty's coffin. David Dimbleby will be taking us through this afternoon's event.
I suppose the way to see this afternoon's service is that if what happened at Westminster Abbey was the grandeur of a state funeral with heads of state, with people from all over the world coming to pay tribute to Her late Majesty, what is going to happen here at Windsor this afternoon is much closer to a family funeral. As Kirsty was saying, the Queen is going to be interred here along with the Queen Mother, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, Princess Margaret, and will lie with 10 other sovereigns going way back to Henry VI in 1471. So it is in that sense the sovereign coming back to the place where our sovereigns, or many of our sovereigns, lie. But on the other hand, the congregation is going to be very different here, as the people sitting here now are perfectly obvious were not in Westminster Abbey. They've assembled here, and they are a different kind of congregation, much smaller. They include for instance, many of the Queen's godchildren. They include large numbers of people who worked on the Queen's estates, whether in Scotland or in Norfolk or in London. Some of them wearing, you see that little medal, the Royal Victorian Order, which several people here are wearing, and that's the order that's in the personal gift of the Queen, only given to people who have worked for her, and it's her decision whether they should have it. So what we'll see here is a quite different service, but with this momentous ending to it, which Hugh was talking about earlier on, the moment when the instruments of monarchy that were presented to her in Westminster Abbey at the coronation are removed from the top of the coffin and returned to those 3 cushions you can just see in the far distance on the altar of St. George's Chapel. The banners, of course, here are of the Royal Order of the Garter, hanging splendidly all the way down. The Garter Knights, who each have to provide the banner, there are 24 of them in all, and members of the royal family as well. So this chapel not only serves the purpose of being the Chapel of Windsor, but also of the Order of the Garter, founded in 1348 by Edward III. So history here, just as in Westminster Abbey, history here is present for this momentous afternoon.
Well, I'm joined now in our studio by the very well-known face, the gardener and broadcaster Alan Titchmarsh. Thank you very much for taking the time,
Pleasure.
especially since this is a personal day for you too, because you knew the Queen, you met her on very many occasions. What are your thoughts today as you've watched, as we've all watched, almost spellbound by some of those images?
I've been so moved, Kirsty, by the fact that we've all come together, as she said we would, and we must. And there's been this enormous sense of togetherness created for us by our late Majesty, the Queen. And the fact that the streets were so lined, that Westminster Abbey was full of the great and the good, but we were there too, in spirit and in many thousands in person. And she has pulled us all together over the years, and I've felt also an enormous sense of continuity. We all thought, oh my goodness me, what will happen when the Queen goes? The Queen has gone, and yet we're still here. She would have wanted us to be. We now have a king who has taken up the reins seamlessly, spoken beautifully right the way through, and I feel safe. I feel as though we have all come together to say we're all right, you know, it will be okay. She gave us 70 years on the throne. We've learned from her. We will not disappoint her. We will carry on, we will be positive, and we will remember her with enormous fondness and respect.
I was wondering what you were making of, to me, although of course a state occasion, and indeed there will never be a grander one than that, but I was looking at the wreath on the coffin, so full of colour. I saw rosemaries, hydrangeas, there were dahlias, oak leaves. It seemed to me it was a very, very personal touch, and I just wondered, you, with your gardener's eye, what you made of that.
Our history was in that wreath. There were oak leaves there. There are oak trees in Windsor Great Park that were growing here and were mature when William the Conqueror invaded in 1066. Some of them are still there, still alive. And it's Hearts of Oak, isn't it, that famous military song? The oak leaves, rosemary, as you say, for remembrance, English roses. And the Prince of Wales, as you know, as I know, is a great gardener. And it was his wreath there, his message on there to his mother, who was also a keener gardener than most people would realise.
I didn't know that. I didn't know she was a gardener.
She loved small flowers. Lily of the Valley was her favourite flower. She loved primroses. The sort of humble flowers in a way, rather like Queen Alexandra, who was Edward VII's queen. She liked what she called her poor little flowers, really small little flowers. And it was a great reminder that one of the lasting great legacies from the Queen was the Queen's green canopy.
Yes.
That carries on. It is of small consolation to me that the first words my sovereign ever spoke to me in 1985 at the Chelsea Flower Show, when I did a cottage garden, she said to me, first time she'd ever spoken, I'd ever met her, she said, your onions are very small. And she must have seen I was crestful. She went on to say, I like them small. When they're large, they taste of nothing at all.
She's quite right. Bracingly frank then. What about what she gave you your MBE when you got
She
your MBE.
did.
And people always say, well, you know, I don't really talk about what she said. Well, maybe now, maybe today is the day to talk about what she said. Well, what was the conversation?
Well, I'd had the great joy. It was 2000. It was the millennium, new era honours that I'd been given the MBE. And in that January, when I knew I'd got it, I was asked to go to Sandringham to talk to the Sandringham WI. Only about 25 members and the Queen in the front row. And I remember standing up to address this AGM. The Queen was right in front of me. And I said, oh, man, we're awfully close, aren't we? And so she took over the table, the trestle table. And she said, yes, you pull, I'll push. And we moved the table. And then I had a lovely time. You know, when you can make the Queen laugh, when you could make the Queen laugh, and she threw her head back, it was genuine laughter and the smile that we all know. And then when I came to my investiture in June, I thought, well, I wonder if she'll say anything about it. And I went up and had my bow, and she said, are you busy? And I thought, I was a bit disappointed, you know, it was a bit general, but I thought, no, she sees a lot of people, she can't remember everything. And I told her what I was doing, television and writing. And at the end, the hand came out, and she shook my hand, she said, well, she said, you give a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure.
She never did.
Well, I didn't really realise until somebody said what to me. So what did she say? And I said, she said, what? And so I was going home in the car with my wife, and I said, you know, I couldn't make up my mind whether to be buried or cremated. I'd quite like to be buried because I'd like a headstone. And on it said, like Alan Titchmarsh, MBE, 1949 to whatever. He gave a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure, Elizabeth R.
Well, she wasn't wrong, was she, Alan?
No.
Extraordinarily, you saw, as he was then, Prince Charles, the night before he was about to become king. A normal night, a special night? It must have presumably been a special night. Prince Charles was there.
It was at Dumfries House, up in Ayrshire, and I've been an ambassador for the Princess Trust and the Princess Countryside Fund for a long time. I've also been, since its formation, an ambassador for the Princess Foundation, which does a huge amount of work, and particularly up in that part of Scotland and around Dumfries House. 12,000 people a year learning all kinds of skills. And I was up there to have a look round, and I saw the Prince in the morning and ran across the landing and said hello, and we had a quick chat, and he said, you know, perhaps you could do the estate walk with me tomorrow, which, as it turned out, I couldn't do, but it's another story, isn't it? We had a dinner in the evening, and it was about 50 people there, so it was quite intimate. And after dinner, we had warm coffee, and we listened to music. There was a sort of penny whistle and a guitar. And the Prince gave the penny whistle player a bottle of scotch and the guitarist a bottle of champagne. And we all chatted, and at about 11 o'clock, the Prince was working his way around the room to leave. And I happened to be standing by the door, and he shook my hand. He said, come for tea sometime. And I said, lovely. I've known him for a long time. And off he went to bed, and off I went to bed, and I got an early flight in the morning. When I got home, I realised that I'd said goodnight to the King on his last night as Prince of Wales. He had no inkling that night before that anything was untoward.
We're looking at pictures now of the Queen's coffin making its way, as I said, towards Windsor, and we can see there's hardly... Well, there isn't a gap, really. People have come out from their homes, their places of work, if they happen to be working today on this bank holiday, and they are very much making their presence felt. And I think, well, we saw how deep the crowds were in central London. It's no surprise.
It's no surprise at all. It's wonderful that people want to be there, as all those hundreds of thousands who filed through Westminster Hall just wanted to be there, to pay their respects, to say thank you. It's a celebration of a life, as well as a mourning of a passing of a very, very important person to all of us.
Alan Titchmarsh, thank you very much for sharing your wonderful memories and your thoughts on such an important day.
Thank you.
People are gathering on the long walk. Anita Rani is there for us.
I was here last night, Kirsty, and a few people were gathering to bag their spots, to spend their night under the stars, to make sure that they got a good position. And what a difference now. The crowds have amassed, all here with one common goal: to witness a moment in history, to watch the procession of Her Majesty the Queen's coffin make the final part of its journey along the Long Walk through to Windsor Castle via the Cambridge Gate, which is behind me. The crowds have come well prepared. They've come with picnics and blankets and chairs, and they've been watching the funeral service on screens that have been erected along the Long Walk. And during the service, it was pin drop silence, and then everybody rose to their feet during the national anthem. The atmosphere here is calm, it's contemplative, it's reflected, it's very peaceful. And the weather gods are smiling on us today. It was warm and overcast this morning, and now the sun has come out. And the people here are from all over the country, all walks of life, young and old. and locals from Windsor as well. Some of them who were lucky enough to meet the Queen, who was very much their neighbour, and I'll be hearing their stories a little bit later.
With me now, watching events unfold today, is the very eminent historian, Sir David Cannadine. We're very happy to have you here. Why Windsor? Why does it end here for Queen Elizabeth II?
It ends here because Windsor is the oldest residence, royal residence of the royal family, going back to Norman times. And more recently, and there's a long perspective here, it's the place where all British monarchs have been buried since George III. Most of them, not all of them, in the chapel here, but all of them within the wider curtilage of Windsor. So it is the place where monarchs finally come to rest, and in the sequence of monarchs, it's now Queen Elizabeth's turn.
Can we draw any conclusions from the fact? I think people very often, when they visit Windsor, when they think of Windsor, they think of Queen Victoria. They see the wonderful statue that's in the centre of Windsor, and of course the mausoleum is here, this grand mausoleum that was built near Frogmore Cottage. Yes, yeah. Near Frogmore. Our longest serving monarch of 70 years doesn't seem to be doing anything that is quite as much of a statement as that. She will be laid to rest in the very intimate privacy of the family crypt. That tells us something about, or does it tell us something about her?
Well, Windsor Castle is a very multifunctional place. It's important to remember that. It began as a fortress, it's a royal home, it's where many members of the royal household work. It has a fabulous library and art collection, and it's a place of worship. So lots of things go on in Windsor, but one of the great things that goes on, which is why we're here today, is that this is where monarchs end their lives and are buried here. Queen Elizabeth, of course, herself had a strong personal connection with Windsor, probably stronger than many monarchs before her, so there are many reasons why it's very fitting that she ends here.
Do you think the strong connection particularly being the teenage years during the war, which really sort of cemented, would it be fair to say, cemented her relationship with the place?
I think it would. Of course, even before that, she spent weekends and time at Royal Lodge when her father was Duke of York, and that's where she acquired her love of country living and dogs and horses. But then, of course, she did live here with Princess Margaret during the Second World War. She made her first broadcast from here. And I think that was a very influential phase in her life. When she became monarch, she spent weekends here during the time that she was at Buckingham Palace during the week, and a variety of events are built around Windsor, the Garter ceremony, for example, Ascot Week. And of course, a great deal of royal pageantry goes on here, state occasions when she welcomed people like President Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So she was very closely associated with here during her very long reign.
Can we think then about today as the moment when the Queen slips from being the person who was our monarch into history, as it were? You know, she is somebody who people will now be reading about. That's a very significant moment, of course, for her family and friends, but in a way it's a shared moment for all of us.
Yes, I think that's right, and in a way it's a moment that will actually linger. It is true that she is passing from being our queen, and most of us never knew the time when there was any other monarch. She has now passed into history. We have a new sovereign, King Charles III. But of course it's true, firstly, that I think many people will remember this day all their lives. But secondly, it's going to take quite a while for my colleagues, historians and biographers, to reach some settled verdict on many aspects of her reign. We know already it was a remarkable reign. She was a great monarch and was much loved. All of that we know and is settled. But how future generations, future historians will come to see her is, I think, something that will need a lot of work on going forward.
It is very interesting that she maintained entirely consistently, as I understand it, the popularity of the monarchy throughout her reign. The figures were always the same. You know, people very much liked her when she came to the throne and very much like her today. It's interesting that as times have changed, and in many ways, she was a monarch managing decline of an empire, decline of Britain's status in the world in so many ways, and yet every overseas paper that I got my hands on this morning on its very front page was the fact that today was the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. It's interesting that there's a sort of tension between those two things, do you think?
Yes, I think that's right. It's clear that in many ways she presided over a period of de-imperialisation, for want of a better word.
It's a good word.
And de-Victorianisation, if you'd like that one as well. And part of her skill at managing that was that she never let on that that was what she was doing.
Yes.
And I think that was crucially important. Yet at the same time as those things were happening, she helped the monarchy adapt. Some thought too slowly, some thought too quickly. I think on the whole she called it right. And I think the recognition that she managed to sustain all of that over 70 years was a very extraordinary achievement. Just as is also the fact that, although we like to think to the contrary, over 70 years she sustained the fact that with very, very few exceptions, we never really knew what she thought about anything.
Isn't that true? And that's so often when I speak to people, indeed at the Jubilee I spoke to many people to try to get an insight, but I suppose it's understandable that somebody who was so constantly under scrutiny would want very firmly to keep part of their life private.
I think that's right, and the hope must be, I speak here of course as a historian, the hope must be that she did indeed keep a diary, which I think there is cause to suppose that she did, and let us hope that she expressed her views there trenchantly and candidly in a way that in public she very properly felt she couldn't.
So interesting to talk to you, Sir David Cannadine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
It's been a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you.
On its way from London to Windsor, the coffin of the Queen carried past large crowds on each side of the road here. Quite extraordinary that in the centre of London people were kept away from the procession. They're making up for it by coming here in their thousands, not just here but at Windsor, down the Long Walk, on each side. This is the road that runs right the way down from the castle to a statue in the far distance. You can just see on the skyline of George III. And Queen Anne had it paved for a carriage. Each side, it looks as though those are flower beds. They're not flower beds. They're flowers that have been laid by the gardeners of Windsor, that have been brought here by thousands of people over the last few days. They've been coming up the hill to the castle, each carrying just a small bouquet, obeying orders, not having it wrapped in cellophane or anything like that, and placing them here, and then the gardeners putting them into a pattern so they look like a planted garden, with sunflowers particularly strong for this time of year. The gates at the bottom are the Cambridge Gate, and this part is private, and this is where the coffin will be brought up towards the castle itself. And when it reaches the top, the Queen, the King and other members of the royal family will join the coffin of the Queen and accompany it from the top of the castle, from the round tower, where the Royal Standard's now flying, not at half-mast. The Royal Standard never flies at half-mast. It's being hoisted to the top of the flagpole to show that King Charles has just arrived. It was at half-mast when it was the Union flag before, but it stays there while the King is present. And so they will walk down through to what's called the lower ward, to St. George's Chapel itself, where the service will take place. And as they come up that long walk, you'll hear a minute gun firing, just as it was in London. The Royal Horse Artillery firing a gun every minute, and 5 seconds after the gun fires, 2 bells ring. One from the chapel itself, just below the chapel, and the other a famous bell called the Sebastopol bell. It was captured in the Crimean War and only rings for moments like this. It last rang in 2002 for the death of the Queen Mother, and it rang again this week for the death of Her Majesty the Queen. So the route liners are in place. We're waiting now for the arrival of the coffin, and there will be a long procession past those thousands we saw on the long walk.
Well, someone who knows Windsor Great Park very well and was looking closely at those beautiful images is the equestrian event organiser Simon Brooks Ward. And it's not just the Great Park, but indeed the Queen herself that you knew very well and you worked closely with throughout the years on the Windsor Horse Show. You are going to the service today. You are that good a friend, and therefore we're very grateful that you've taken the time on what I'm sure is a very difficult day for you. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've given 1 or 2 interviews over the last week or so, and you know, every time I come away, I can't believe I'm talking in the past tense about the Queen. Even now, I have trouble thinking that the Queen has finally gone, and I hope that this afternoon there'll be time for reflection and a little bit of closure and also understanding it and grieving as well.
Over the past days, of course, what we hear so often is she was a country woman at heart, and we try to in a way get to the bottom of that, and one of the ways to unpack it, of course, is her relationship with horses, the equestrian fraternity. It all began with a little pony called, was it Peggy?
Peggy.
Tell me a bit about Peggy.
Well, Peggy is a little Shetland pony, and as we know, they can be either great or they can be really curmudgeonly. And I think Peggy was okay actually, but she had a really big instructor called Sybil Smith, who was one of these sort of redoubtable women who got the Queen riding and interested in ponies from the very beginning. And that connection, you know, with an animal like a horse or a pony, it doesn't matter whether you're a queen or a pauper or whatever, it's the connection, they don't know it, and the Queen had a wonderful connection with horses. And
I wonder maybe if that was really at the root of it, because horses and dogs, she loved horses and dogs, and of course they just met her on the same terms as they met any human being. You know, they weren't looking at the crown, they weren't looking at the orb and the sceptre, she was just another human being, and I wonder maybe if therein lay part of the attraction for her.
Absolutely, it was simple pleasures, and you know, when you're getting away from matters of state and you're dealing with your dogs or your horses or the surroundings that you're in, it was tremendously relaxing for the Queen, and that's what we saw at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. Absolutely, the total relaxation for the Queen to come down and see her horses and ponies, which she did for 79 years.
79 years?
Yeah.
She never missed one? Never missed one,
and was there most days. And recently, the State Opening in Parliament happened on the Wednesday. Well, I don't know how the Queen did it, but the Queen took off the crown, the robes of state and everything else, and was here by lunchtime to see her ponies in the ring. It was amazing.
And she was a very accomplished horsewoman herself. Is it true, and I've read this and I've never been able to check it out with anybody else, I guess you're the person to ask, was she still riding her fell ponies into her early 90s?
Oh yes.
That's true?
Yes, it's true. And the Queen was a fantastic horsewoman and person, and I always say that nobody knows or knew as much about a horse or a pony than the Queen. She had an incredible encyclopedic memory about horses and what breeding lines and bloodlines and everything else.
So she loved them. Did they love her? Was the feeling mutual?
Oh yeah. We all knew that the Queen was not very tall. And sometimes these big horses are not well behaved, sometimes. But with the Queen, she absolutely commanded them. And it was done because it was relaxed. She stood there, she stood her ground, and the Queen tended to have this relationship, which is extraordinary. It was almost horse whispering.
Really?
Yeah, it was amazing to see the Queen around horses.
June, of course, means Ascot, and she was a devoted attendee of Ascot. It's interesting to think about the work that she did. I mean, obviously, it was enjoyment for her, but she brought the racing fraternity really into the spotlight, and we have, I guess, the amount of overseas money and the people who are very interested and want to be part of horse racing because they associate it with something dignified and something wonderful, and they associate it with the monarchy. She did a lot for the industry of racing.
Industry of racing, industry of horses and ponies. I mean, the Queen didn't just have a horse and see it race. The Queen knew about its journey, you know, from foal to the winning post. And that gave a great sense of accomplishment and pleasure for the Queen. And it was the same with the horses and ponies. And I always say to people that there are rare breeds in ponies and horses. and she was responsible for saving at least 7 through her patronage and support, so that we now see today not only survive, but they're thriving as well, like the Highland Pony.
Now, never mind winning the Gold Cup with Estimate in 2013. I hear she liked to win the rosettes at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. She was chuffed, was she, when she got one?
Really great pleasures. And I remember wandering up to the Queen, and she just stood there in her blue gilet and a headscarf and sensible shoes and a tweed skirt.
Good woman.
And you know, so she was pretty incognito. And I remember wandering up to one ring, and she'd had a real sort of blue ribbon day, because you hauled out this load of rosettes out of her pocket and said, "Simon, look what I've won." And you know, she was so pleased, and her smile was radiant. And she put them on her dining room table every night. Every time she won a cup at Royal Windsor Horse Show or a rosette, she put it on the dining room table.
Simon Brooks-Ward, we are very grateful for you sharing those wonderful, intimate memories. We will let you go now to St George's Chapel. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much indeed.
I am with not just any old Windsor family, 6th generation Windsor family. Geoffrey, lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
You're 90 now, but during the war, you got a very special invite to Windsor Castle, didn't you?
I did, yes, absolutely. I was invited
to go and see
the pantomime.
The pantomime.
Oh yes, yeah, the pantomime. I went to see the pantomime, which was absolutely amazing. It was fantastic.
How old were you?
I was 8 years of age.
8 years old. And who was in the pantomime?
The pantomime, well, I want to call them Princess Elizabeth and Princess Anne.
Margaret.
Sorry, Princess Margaret.
We're with you. Well, there were princesses then.
Yeah, they were the princesses, that's right. Because it's a long time ago, but I think I'm probably the only person that's ever been to there, because I was taken, and I was so enthusiastic about it because it was so wonderful. I went round and picked up the programmes, and I talked to the princesses, and they talked to me.
What did you talk about? Do you remember?
Yes, they just said, "Hi, you know, what are you doing? How are you about?" And I said, "Well, did you enjoy doing it?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely, we loved it."
What a lovely, lovely memory and an experience. Can we see the mementos that you've got in your hand? So what do we have here? We've got tickets to see Aladdin.
Yeah.
And a letter sent, and this is your tickets came in this letter. How did you manage to get the tickets?
Well, my parents knew the headmaster there of the Royal School, who in fact produced the pantomimes.
And Andrew, you've been hearing these stories your whole life.
Oh, all my life, yes.
How special?
Incredibly special, and sort of rooted my father at such a young age to the whole Windsor royal connection.
And you've got your own